So it is time for us to begin. Warmly welcome, dear colleagues. It is a true delight to be able on this occasion to welcome Sir David Cannadine. He's Dodge Professor in History at Princeton University, and he's also, as of last year, the President of the British Academy. He's also a visiting professor at Oxford University. You have received, some of you at least, a handout, so some basic information. I can assure you that if you had been subjected to the full CV, it would have taken you quite a long time to digest that. But I will mention one or two things. Sir David was educated originally at Cambridge University, where his BA received the Robbins Prize. He continued with master studies, also at Cambridge in history, and his doctorate was received at Oxford University. He was then subsequently for a number of years associated as a lecturer with Cambridge University, where he was also lecturing at Christ's College. And subsequently he spent about a decade in the United States as professor of history at Columbia University. He was the more collegiate professor of history at Columbia. That was between 1988 actually and 1998. He then returned to Britain and was holding the position as director of the Institute of Historical Research and professor of history at the University of London. Between 2003 and 2008, he was holder of the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother Professor of British History at the University of London. And since 2008, he has been associated or teaching at Princeton University, where he is, as I mentioned, the Dodge Professor of History. I would like to say that, I could go on mentioning visiting appointments and distinguished lectures for a very long time, but I want to emphasize that the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study is not the first institute for advanced study that Sir David has visited. Already in 1980-81, he was a member of the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where he has also returned to which an institute to which he has returned subsequently. So in 2011, he was the director's visitor at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is there is basically one person holding that position. And this was in the time when somebody well known to several persons in this room was the director, namely Peter Goddard. He has also been a fellow of the National Humanities Center. I mentioned these institutions not least because we will be visited by the heads of these institutes in about 2 months' time. But he's been a fellow at the National Humanities Center, at the Australian National University, Canberra, and a number of other institutions, including the Huntington Library, which is a wonderful institution in every respect. So David is also a key person at the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Science and Humanities, CRASH, at Cambridge, an institution with which we have, as many of you know, very close links. It would be impossible to enumerate all the honorary positions and the positions of service to the scholarly community and the wider societal community that Sir David has been holding or is holding. In the handout, we mention that he's a trustee of the Wolfson Foundation, of the Royal Academy, of the Rothschild Archive, Gladstone's Library, the Gordon Brown Archive Trust. He is also sitting on the Bank of England Banknote Character Advisory Committee and is Vice Chair of the Westminster Abbey Fabric Commission. He's Vice Chair of the Trustee of Trustees of Royal Palaces and the Vice President of the Victorian Society. We also in passing mentioned that he is the editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biographies and Vice Chair of the past and present editorial board. One of the most wonderful historical journals you could read, I would argue. I may mention in passing that he has also been the general editor of the Penguin History of Britain and general editor of the Penguin History of Europe, and serving in a number of other comparable positions. Allow me to say that a number of his early books dealt with the role of the British aristocracy. On the handout, we mentioned the important, very significant book on the decline and fall of the British aristocracy, which came out in the early 90s, but already in 1980 had published a book on lords and landlords, and there are a number of others dealing with the aristocratic class in Britain. The handout also mentioned his books on Ornamentalism, which came out in 2001, the book on how the British saw their empire, and the biography of Mellon, which is an important work, I think, from the point of view both of an understanding of patronage and the role of research and the support for research endeavors. I should also mention, we mentioned actually handout also the book on the Undivided Past, Humanity Beyond Our Differences, and the recent biographies of King George V and of Margaret Thatcher. But there are a number of other works that I think deserve mention, and I will not attempt really to characterize these works, but they are important not least for the fact that many of them are monographs that of course are based on very thorough archival work, but Sir David also has published a number of very important books that contribute to our public understanding of history and societal transformations in history. That was one of the reasons why I mentioned these penguin histories. But he is a frequent contributor to radio and television in the UK and beyond, and he has published also many thought-provoking and important overviews of development of an historical nature. So Sir David is a truly important public intellectual, as well as he is the epitome of the careful historian doing the deepest possible archival research based on primary sources. We have had the great pleasure of having Sir David in residence for the entire academic year so far, and I don't want to contemplate that there could be a time when we shall miss these wonderful lunch conversations and intellectual encounters that really is providing a very bright spot for the daily life, not only for me, but for all the fellows of the Collegium. But thank you so much for being with us, and we greatly look forward to your lecture.
Well, Bjorn, thank you so much for those immensely kind and generous words. Like many people gathered here, I earn my living by speaking as well as writing, as a result of which I have, of course, become an unrivaled connoisseur of introductions to myself, which is not a fiercely competed for position. And I've never forgotten that when I was on the road with my Andrew Mellon book, I arrived in Kansas and I was given a dinner which was very generous, and I had to speak afterwards, which I don't always like to do. And the person in charge began, I thought rather promisingly, by saying David Cannadine is the author of the greatest biography of Andrew Mellon ever written. And I rather preened myself at this point and thought the evening started well. He then rather spoilt the effect by adding, it is of course the only biography of Andrew Mellon ever written. So Bjorn, thank you so much for not having said that. One other and rather more important introductory remark. Several people here, I'm sure, knew Clifford Geertz at the Institute for Advanced Study. Cliff was a strange figure. He was awkward and dishevelled and curmudgeonly and utterly devoid of charm, even by the relatively low standards of the academic profession. But, as it were, either despite that or because of that, he wrote like an angel. He wrote some of the most beautiful academic prose of anybody, I think, working in our time. And in one of his late books, he said that the chance to work and to think and to write at the Institute of Advanced Study had been for him what he described as a redemptive gift. And I've thought about those words a great deal since I arrived here last September, since they apply at least as much to me here, and perhaps to others too, as they did to him there. So I'm very delighted to have this opportunity to say, both gratefully and publicly, that to have the chance to spend a year here at Scas is indeed a redemptive gift. My subject tonight is the history of philanthropy in general and the history of the Ford Foundation in particular, and that on the whole is what I've been working on with some other distractions while I've been here. But before I kind of get to the substance of that, both in general and in particular, can I just state, I've done this once before, but may I do it again, where I'm coming from as a historian in this instance of philanthropy. And I begin by observing that when I began my career as an academic and as a historian, I never thought I would become involved with the worlds of philanthropy or the worlds of fundraising. That was what other people did. It wasn't what academics did, and it certainly wasn't what I expected to do. Yet, for a variety of utterly flukish and unexpected, unanticipated, and unpredictable reasons, this is exactly what has happened to me, and in a variety of ways. First of all, and especially for reasons that aren't clear, I have done quite a lot of fundraising. I raised about £15 million for the Institute of Historical Research, £5 million for the National Portrait Gallery, and I'm in the process of trying to raise £25 million at the moment for the British Academy. So I have spent, and I do spend, quite a lot of my time asking people for money and talking to people who have a lot of money, or talking to organisations that have a lot of money and trying to persuade them to give some to the organisations with which I'm connected. But I also, and perhaps rather surprisingly in the light of that, give money away. As a trustee of the Wolfson Foundation, I chair its arts panel, through which applications come from universities, from museums, from galleries, and from historic buildings. And as a result of that, I get thanked for giving away money that isn't mine in the first place, and that's a very agreeable position to find oneself in. And thirdly, I write about philanthropy. I'm not only a practitioner of it, in the sense of raising money and giving money away, but I actually write about it as well. Initially, in the case of Andrew W. Mellon, mentioned by Bjorn, who set up the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., gave it a huge endowment, gave it all his best pictures. And now, of course, in the case of the Ford Foundation, whose history I'm writing. So that's, as it were, where I come from. This either means, and I hope it does, that I, as it were, know more about doing philanthropy than most historians do, and than most people do who write about it, or it means I'm very complicit in this process, but I hope the second of those things is not, as it were, a disqualification for taking on this project. So that's where I come from, but now some general remarks, as I promised, about the history of philanthropy before I get to the Ford Foundation in particular. It's fair to say that there has been quite a lot written, and at different times there have been centres for the history and the study of philanthropy in the United States, though there are fewer of them now than there once were, and these remarks are on the whole confined to the United States. But in general, I think it's fair to say that although philanthropy is a major element in US history and US life, it's not a very well-developed academic field. Most of the biographers of rich men who gave money away are written by professional biographers, and that's a skill in itself, but not by historians, and they don't, I think, have a broader view of things in the way that we historians like to think we do. And most books on foundations themselves, such as they have been, tend to be in-house studies which are often little more than a summary of a series of annual reports with very little sense of the broader context, either of the history of philanthropy itself, of American history, or where appropriate, as is certainly true with Ford, of international history. And as a result, they often tend to be celebratory, internally preoccupied, and inward-looking, but of very little broader significance. Put another way, this means that the history of philanthropy is rarely a subject to which serious academic historians give much serious attention. And that, I think, is a pity, because it does seem to me to be a very serious subject where the skills of historians are needed to make it work and to make it come alive. And let me suggest, in the light of that, some of the sort of issues that the history of philanthropy needs to grapple with, but all too often fails to do so, and that I shall certainly be addressing in this book of mine. Why, for example, do American foundations cluster at particular times in terms of the dates of their establishment? The Progressive Era, Russell Sage, Carnegie and Rockefeller, the New Deal, Ford and Hershey and Johnson, and the 1990s and 2000s, Bill and Melinda Gates above all, but they're far from being the only ones. I doubt very much if the answer is the same each time. The first one, of course, the Progressive Era of trust busting and robber barons and what Theodore Roosevelt called malefactors of great wealth. The New Deal, rich people were less rich, but FDR, of course, put through a lot of anti-wealth legislation, and I'll come back to that. And the 1990s and the 2000s, the growth in inequality and prodigious fortunes often being made for the first time by young people, so that philanthropy became a young person's activity rather than, as previously, an old person's activity. As somebody, I think Warren Buffett may have said, when it comes to philanthropy, 30 is the new 70. And that, I think, put it rather well. The second question, what are the motives for rich people setting up foundations? This is exceptionally difficult to fathom, not least because I suspect that many of those who established foundations to give money away didn't really know what their motives were themselves. Often I think the motives were deeply personal, familial, religious, or perhaps occasionally genuinely altruistic. Perhaps a way of atoning for the guilt of vast wealth accumulated by dubious means. Perhaps the outcome of power struggles within a rich family. Perhaps arrangements to avoid paying tax. Perhaps the expression of deep religious conviction, or perhaps the product of deathbed wishes for immortality, or even a genuine desire to make the world better. But it's absolutely clear that when it comes to philanthropic motivation, there's no one size that fits all, and that in itself is, I think, a serious challenge for historians. Andrew Carnegie famously observed that the man who died rich died disgraced and resolved to give most of his money away, in fact, before he died. John D. Rockefeller had very strong religious convictions. The Hershey Foundation was set up to ensure the Hershey family kept control of both their own chocolate business and the money they gave away. By contrast, William Randolph Hearst set up foundations to ensure his children would have absolutely no control over either his newspapers or over his money. There's also, I think, a need to deal with the paradoxes and contradictions that American foundations are, by their very nature, private accumulations of wealth, ostensibly, apparently, substantively, devoted to the purposes of public good. Nevertheless, because many of them are so rich, this of course gives them huge power. And although they are constrained by various pieces of federal legislation, the fact remains that although wielding potentially enormous influence, both at home and overseas, they are not in any way publicly accountable, but only responsible to their trustees. And although it's private wealth in the public interest, it is therefore entirely up to the foundation to decide who the public are and what their interest is. This in turn perhaps helps explain why the great American foundations, and in fact the Ford Foundation in particular, have often been, and still are, very controversial. And they are disapproved of, interestingly, by critics on the left and critics on the right. To those on the left, they are all too often seen as disingenuous ways of perpetuating the iniquities and the inequities of capitalism at home, while claiming to be doing precisely the opposite, that's to say often allegedly promoting equality. Or they are seen by critics of the left as latter-day agents of American neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism, while claiming that their aim is to establish democracy in other parts of the world. On the other hand, to their critics on the right, they embody the worst excesses of sanctimonious liberalism or political correctness in their support for civil rights, for women's rights, for blacks, and for the end of apartheid in South Africa. And the fact that they are criticised from both ends of the political spectrum, apparently in a sort of mutually exclusive way, tells one quite a lot, I suppose, about what they're up to and what their position is more broadly in American society. Another question, of course, is how and by what processes do foundations decide what causes to support? In certain cases, the priorities were set by the original donors. Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example, wanted to endow a university in a major southern city in the aftermath of the Civil War as a gesture meant to promote North-South reconciliation. Hence, of course, Vanderbilt University. Andrew Carnegie wanted to support libraries because he believed that all towns and even villages ought to have libraries as a way for ordinary people to get a serious sort of education. Mrs. Russell Sage was above all concerned with higher education, including, rather innovatively at that time, higher education for women. By contrast, Jessie Ball DuPont sought to use her huge amount of family wealth to oppose racial desegregation in the South, wherever liberalism appeared to rear its ugly head. But many foundations, many of the greatest foundations, among them Rockefeller, the Commonwealth Fund, and of course Ford, were devoted and remain devoted to enhancing the general welfare of mankind. Well, that's all okay, but how did they decide where to focus their efforts, both in terms of the programs and in terms of geographically too? Here's another question. How do foundations change over time in terms of their personnel and in terms of what they do and how they operate? Close-up institutional histories tend not to see this matter as being important, or indeed not to see it as being a matter at all. But these changes are significant. One familiar version of that is that the founding families of some of these great foundations often later withdrew in disappointment and disenchantment as they saw their foundation, which they had wanted to proclaim their values, taken over by bureaucrats and liberals. And that's certainly true of Rockefeller and Ford and Mellon, where in each case, finally, the family withdrew on the basis of disenchantment and disappointment. It's also the case, and that's part of the reason, that especially from the 1950s and 1960s onwards, in response to federal legislation, many of the foundations had to divest themselves of their original shareholdings in the companies which the founders of these foundations had created and which made them rich. Rockefeller in the case of Standard Oil, Ford, of course, in the case of the Ford Motor Company, and the Mellon Foundation in the case of Gulf Oil. It's also, of course, the case that the scale and scope of philanthropies can change, especially, and as I'll show it in more detail in a moment, in the case of Ford, which moved within the space of 20 years from being a small-scale philanthropy based in Detroit to being the largest in the world, determined to make the world better. And the means of operation can change in broader ways than that, from a paternalist or quasi-imperialist belief that the foundation knows what's best and what needs doing, especially abroad, to being much more responsive to what indigenous people out there think they know and decide what they want, and the foundation in its turn then attempts to help them. Another question, and one which seems to me to be extraordinarily difficult to answer, and one I think which foundations are particularly tender about, if I can put it that way. And that is the question, how is it possible to assess the impact of what they do and the success of what they do? The case, after all, for giving large, rich American foundations the extensive tax breaks they get as not-for-profit organisations is that they are doing public work which would not otherwise be done and which does make a great impact and enhances humanity's well-being. And it's certainly true that some of the greatest foundations have indeed had very high ambitions as to what they want to do, what they hope to do, and what they might achieve. Rockefeller with its huge global public health programs during the interwar years. Is one example of that, and the Ford Foundation is another, with its support for the disciplines of sociology, black studies and women's studies as academic disciplines in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, sometimes it's clear that these programs have been successful, but on other occasions they've not been successful. The Rockefeller public health programs in the interwar years worked in some countries but not in others, but in retrospect were generally thought to be excessively ambitious to try to fix the world's health within a generation. And some of Ford's educational programs in the 1960s and 70s were equally unsuccessful. But it's very hard to get a sense of what failure or success are, or what the modes of evaluation might be to help work that out. And of course, as foundations exist, or these foundations exist in perpetuity, then as it were, critics might say, well, how much longer are they going to go on putting up programs that aren't working? All of which is another way of saying that it's often turned out that improving the general well-being of mankind is extremely difficult to do, or at least it's extremely difficult to measure if you have in fact succeeded at doing that. This in turn leads to two other important and increasingly, I think, posed questions. First, and as I've already suggested, are these so-called perpetual foundations, Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, Mellon, in fact the best vehicles for giving large sums of money away? Surely it's been argued, and it's increasingly argued now, they should spend down the money, liquidate, go out of business, say they've had their go, and leave it alone. After all, as somebody said, perpetuity is a very long time to be in business. But second, my second question, are the recent philanthropic alternatives that have increasingly come into being in this last phase of creation of philanthropies, the 2000s, the 1990s, and on into our own time, are there any better? The current slogan, the very antithesis of the Perpetual Foundation, is giving while living. And this, of course, describes the new and recent worlds of strategic philanthropy and of philanthrocapitalism, where the donors will spend their millions in their lifetime on what they want to spend, and they're not going to leave it to liberals and bureaucrats 30 years on to spend it on things they wouldn't want it spent on. And what is more, when there are much more professional, strategic plans and explicit performance indicators of impact. This is very much now, in the United States, the new form of philanthropy going forward. It's too soon to know, I think, if it's working. Again, the performance indicators are not perhaps entirely clear, and it's certainly said by critics of this new form of philanthrocapitalism that it's much more short-term, that the advantage of perpetual foundations is they can take a long view and put money into projects that may only come good 10, 20, 30, 40 years on. Whereas philanthrocapitalists want, as it were, instant gratification, instant signs of progress, and that this is not a helpful way of thinking about what philanthropy can do and the time frame in which it can do it. That's very much, in American philanthropic circles, the current conversation. The claim at the moment being that the great foundations that seemed the only way to do it, and part of the unchanging order of things, have had their day, and that we are now into a wholly new world of a different, more exciting, more nimble, more responsible, more evaluatable form of philanthropy. Whether that's true or not, I think, isn't clear. And I suppose the final point here is, of course, the need for some sort of comparative perspective. Since American foundations are in fact far from being the only ones, although that tends to be how they think of themselves, and indeed of how they are written about. But there are plenty of foundations, of course, in Britain, most created after the Second World War, although few of them are anything like as rich as the richest American foundations. And there are, as of course I've been discovering, the very different model of Scandinavian and German foundations, where they remain closely connected in many cases with the businesses which are the source of their wealth in a way that would simply not be legally possible in the United States. Well, those seem to me to be some of the issues, if, as I'm trying to do, you're writing about one of the great American foundations, that you have to kind of struggle with, because they are subjects which deserve to be engaged with in what seems to me to be a serious way, and those issues that I've just enumerated seem to me to be precisely some of the ones that ought to be addressed. And as I work through this project, I'm clear that I shall have to address them, and indeed the book is framed with a big introduction setting up many of these issues, and of course by the time I get to the end, one of the things that the conclusion will have to do is to say, well, this is the history of a perpetual foundation written in a time when there seems to be an alternative preferred model, and quite where that conclusion will go, I'm not yet sure. Let me, in the light of that, then talk a little bit about how I got to this Ford project and two particular aspects of the way the project works. The reason I'm actually writing this history is because, at the urging of a former president of the Ford Foundation, Susan Beresford, I wrote a letter to the current president, Darren Walker, and told him that this was something I would like to do, and he agreed that I ought to do it. As it happens, I had already met Darren in 2011, when I was summoned to the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, for whom Darren then worked, and when I was asked to write their centenary history. But since that centenary was only 2 years later, I told them that it was already about 5 years too late to write such a history, and that wasn't possible, at least for me. And I don't think any such history ever in the end emerged. Nevertheless, Darren and I stayed in touch, and when he moved to Ford as its president, I sensed an opportunity, wrote to him, and the result is that this is what I'm now doing. This, of course, raises some rather serious issues in turn, and let me focus on two of them. This project on which I'm embarked is a specific illustration of a general trend, or what it might be more candid to describe as a general problem. Namely, that most of the writing on American foundations and American philanthropy, historical, sociological, in-house history, whatever it may be, tends to be funded and financed by the foundations and the philanthropies themselves. And so that's true for me. In this particular case, Ford is paying for the research assistants and the project manager, I'll come to them in a minute, for the very considerable expenses involved in a great deal of overseas travel, because Ford has lots of overseas offices. And I must also declare it's paying for half of my salary over the next 4 years, so I can go half-time at Princeton to get the writing done. Well, this in turn, of course, begs a very serious question. How, in the light of all that, how independent can my history possibly be? How can I engage with the set of issues that I've already outlined in general terms, if the process of doing so will involve, as it will and does, a criticism of the foundation itself? I pondered this question a lot, and I feel that it's important that I should. And to sharpen it up, how can I possibly be critical of an organisation that is actually paying me to write about it? Well, all I can say in reply to that is that I only agreed to write the book on the condition that I had full access to all the relevant material and full freedom to form my own judgments, and that's written in to the contract and to the deal, as it was when I wrote The Life of Andrew Mellon at the behest of the Andrew Mellon Foundation. What is more, since Darren Walker became president, he has committed the foundation to being much more transparent and open in its operations than it has been before, and he sees my book as being one way to deliver on that agenda. So that's, as it were, the best answer I can come up with to that undeniable ethical dilemma. Of course, it's also the case, for reasons I'm just about to come on to, that if Ford did not finance this history, it would never actually be written at all. And on balance, I think it's better that it is written than that it isn't. And so to my second point, which is that this is a project on a truly industrial scale, for which a team of research assistants is not optional, but essential. At the last count, there were several hundred archives, I repeat that, several hundred archives across the United States and around the globe containing relevant material. Since the range of institutions and individuals who make up the Ford Foundation story was and is astonishingly wide. It is, after all, the history of the two-thirds of the American century. Virtually any major figure in public life, in philanthropy, in politics, in academia, in America from the 1930s onwards was engaged and involved with the Ford Foundation somewhere or other. And the Ford Foundation's own archive is of prodigious size, with tens of thousands of files on programs, grants, trustees meeting, finances and personnel. And there's not just the major Ford archive at the Rockefeller Archive Center in New York, but it's also the case that the Foundation's overseas offices in Latin America, in Africa, the Middle East and Asia all have their own archives as well, detailing the Foundation's dealings with those parts of the world to which it has made many grants. Now, it's fair to say that there is simply no way in which a single scholar acting on his own or her own could both get through all of that and hope to write the book this side of eternity. So the way this is set up is that there is a team of 3 full-time researchers overseen by a project manager who arranges all the logistics, and they are all overseen by me. We meet regularly, either, as it were, by phone or in person, and between us we have worked out a strategy dividing the history of the Ford Foundation into 5 chronological sections, each of which is worked on by the 3 researchers for a year at a time. They produce the raw materials with appropriate annotations and commentaries, but they do not, I must repeat this, they do not write draft chapters for me, to which I would then, as it were, dishonestly attach my name, a technique employed by some other historians who I wouldn't dream of mentioning. On the contrary, they produce the raw materials, they are academically and intellectually engaged with the raw materials, but in the end it's up to me to decide how to work out an expositional strategy for the book, because the way the research is organised is around themes over quite long periods of time, whereas the expositional strategy is rather a different one. So last academic year, from, as it were, the summer of 2016 to the summer of 2017, they worked on the period from 1935 to 1953, and that's what I am writing about here during my time here. And we should continue that way until the project is finished. Again, it's in a way a counsel of necessity and of inevitability. This book could not be written, the history of the Ford Foundation could not be written without doing it this way. I've used research assistants before, I'm well aware of the problems, but I must repeat, I don't see any other way of doing this project than the way we have set it up. Well, what then, in the light of all that, have I learned about and been writing about during my time here? I can't, of course, give you any more than a slight taster drawn from what I've been writing about the years from 1935 to the early 1950s. But this is part 1, the opening section, and it is called, because this is what happens, from Detroit to New York and far beyond. The key figure here is, of course, Henry Ford himself, born in the 1860s. Ford was just about half a generation younger than the robber barons with whom he's often bracketed, such as Frick and Mellon and Carnegie and Morgan. And he was, in some ways, a sort of genius, because it's Ford more than anyone else in the American automobile industry, who actually, as it were, creates that industry. The first person to establish a system of mass production for motor cars and a system of mass production for cheap motor cars, which will appeal to a mass market rather than just expensive cars for a limited market. And most famously, of course, in the case of the Model T, which he produced in the 1910s and on into the 1920s, the most successful automobile ever created up to that time. And it's largely, not entirely, but largely as a result of those extraordinary innovations in production and also in marketing that Detroit, where Ford was based, became the metropolis of automobile production in the United States from the 1900s through until the 1920s. And as a result of that, by the early 1920s, Henry Ford was one of the richest men in the United States and indeed in the world. And the Ford Motor Company was entirely privately owned by Henry Ford himself, by his son Edsel, and by their wives. It was not a publicly quoted company. It was the largest privately owned company in the Western world. All the shares were owned by the Ford family. They had complete control and ownership of their company. Henry was a man who gave a lot of money from his own pocket to local charities, especially to the local hospital in Detroit, named the Henry Ford Hospital. And he actually paid his workers really rather well by comparisons with other automobile companies in Detroit, in particular Chrysler and General Motors. But I have to say, and I shall not pull any punches here, he was not a nice man. He was a rabid anti-Semite who owned a newspaper in the 1920s which published a huge amount of anti-Jewish propaganda. And later on he was lionized in Nazi Germany and given the highest award that Nazi Germany could bestow on anyone who wasn't German. He was rabidly hostile to organized labor and fought almost to the end of his life to prevent workers in the Ford factories in Detroit joining the Union of Auto Workers. He loathed organised labour, as so many of those people did. Andrew Mellon was another, and so, of course, was Frick. And like them, the work regime in the Ford factories, even though he paid his employers well, was one of fear and intimidation. And when workers went on strike in the 1930s, in order to try to get Ford to yield on their unionising, he set his security workers on them, and they shot a lot of their own, Ford's employees. He also treated his son Edsel very badly. This is a standard trope in many American rich families, that the founding figure who creates the money despises the son and heir as a weakling, even as they, of course, hope that they will carry on the great enterprise that they themselves have created. This is a characteristic of Rockefeller, of Getty, of Mellon, and even, I dare say, of the Trump dynasty as well. And Henry bullied Edsel unconscionably for most of Edsel's life, beginning with bestowing on him a name that Edsel always hated having. He saw him as a weakling, he sought to toughen him up, and of course that only made Edsel more upset than he was before. What is more, Henry was a total Philistine, utterly uninterested in the higher things of life. When Joel Juvine, who was the greatest impresario and the greatest driver of the international art market of his generation, selling pictures offloaded by impoverished British aristocrats to American plutocrats like Mellon and Frick and Huntington, when Juvine went to see Henry Ford, believing that Ford should also be buying pictures, Ford said, no, Mr. Juvine, there's absolutely no point in buying posh pictures and expensive old masters. You can now get postcards of them, and they're really very well reproduced. So Henry had no interest in the higher things of life at all. Edsel, by comparison, was an aesthete, a patron of the arts, a collector of pictures. He financed the extraordinary set of murals in the Detroit Art Institute by Diego Rivera. And for Edsel, Making cars was about aesthetics and design, whereas for Henry it was about production and marketing. And relations between Henry and Edsel are a kind of Gothic horror show in the way that, as I say, is often the case in American rich plutocratic dynasties. So those are some of the themes that, as it were, play out into the 1920s and 1930s in the Ford family. A certain degree of philanthropy, a certain degree of local obligation to Detroit, but an extraordinary set of very reactionary views on the part of Henry I, and a terrible relation between the father and the son. And part of understanding how the Ford Foundation comes into being is, as it were, relating to that. 1930s, which is when the story really begins. Well, of course, the great crash and huge unemployment in Detroit. One thing that people can't do when they're out of work, as more Americans were in the 1930s than ever before, is afford to buy motor cars. Detroit was a one-horse or one-motor town, and it suffered very badly in the recession. Soaring unemployment, bank failures. Henry Ford refused to guarantee the banks. He thought failure was good for people, which it was easy for him to do if you were as rich as he was. His reputation did not improve during that period. At the same time, the Ford Motor Company was itself especially hard hit. After the halcyon years of the Model T, which ended in 1927, Ford failed to produce a new car that was as sensationally successful as the Model T had been, whereas General Motors and Chrysler actually were producing cars more successfully. So the company wasn't doing well. To make things worse, Henry Ford, like his fellow plutocrats, loathed Roosevelt for his attacks on rich people, for his determination to interfere in the workings of the free market. Whereas, of course, and predictably, Edsel rather liked Franklin Roosevelt. The patronage of Edsel at the Detroit Art Institute, the Diego Rivera murals, was thought to be the inspiration for many of FDR's own federal art projects. And Edsel actually funded the place down in Georgia where FDR would go to convalesce. But the tipping point here was the 1935 Revenue Act, which was passed in the early phases of the New Deal, which raised taxes on estates to levels well above 70%. Huge tax hike. This was when FDR was campaigning, in particular, against the forces of greed and selfishness and lust for power, as he called them, and Henry Ford could certainly be described in those terms. But what the Revenue Act also did was to provide huge tax exemptions for charitable giving. If you gave money away to philanthropic organisations, it wasn't liable for federal tax. And that's the key to the establishment of the Ford Foundation, which was set up early in 1936, and it's not at all coincidence that that's only a few months after the end of 1935. And it was initially set up with a small sum of $25,000, worth more then than now, but still not exactly a great deal. And soon after the foundation was set up, in the spring of 1936, Henry Ford and Edsel remade their wills, and each will had the same clause, bequeathing all their non-voting shares in the Ford Motor Company, and they were 90% of the shares of the Ford Motor Company, to the Ford Foundation. Why did they do that? They did that because they were worried that if taxes were levied at the higher rate brought in 1935 on their estates, especially Henry's an old man by now, not only would they have to sell all the non-voting shares in the motor company to pay the bill, they would have to sell the voting shares. And the great ambition which lay behind creating the Ford Foundation was to ensure that by giving all the non-voting shares to the Ford Foundation, their tax liabilities would be so reduced that they could hang on to all the voting shares, thereby keeping control of the company, which was above all else what Henry wanted. So it is the case that the Ford Foundation was set up as an elaborate means of tax avoidance, that's to say the non-voting shares would not be liable for tax, and of ensuring that they kept control of the company. And it's absolutely clear that for Henry Ford, that was the motive in setting the foundation up. I think, given their rather different personalities and priorities, for Edsel it was a rather different story. I think Edsel was genuinely interested in developing the Ford family's philanthropic interests, especially into areas to do with the fine arts, of a kind that Henry wasn't interested in. But Edsel saw the potential in the Ford Foundation for doing that. So, that's how this extraordinary organisation gets set up, as a kind of shoestring local Detroit philanthropy, though down the road it was going to become something very different. From 1936 to 1943, it was run entirely by the family as part of a broader world of Ford interests, including the motor company and the family itself. Edsel was president of the Ford Foundation, but Henry was never a trustee. He felt he'd done all he needed to do in getting the things set up. And across that period, Henry and Edsel and the Ford Motor Company gradually begin to move money into the foundation, so that by the early 1940s it was worth about $30 million. And it was giving out roughly between $500,000 and $1 million a year to local causes, especially the Detroit General Hospital and the Detroit Symphony, and that's all it was doing. It was a very local, parochial, almost small town enterprise. On the other hand, of course, even as that was the case, looking into the future, the prognosis was potentially very good and certainly very different. When Henry died, which surely wouldn't be far off, and when Edsel died, which surely ought to be quite a great deal off, the foundation would get their shares in the motor company and would become astonishingly rich, though it would have no control over the company. And that's, as it were, the future that's anticipated in the late 30s and early 40s. But then it all slightly goes wrong, and didn't, at least in the short run, work out like that. Partly because by the late 30s and early 40s, the Ford Motor Company was in a very bad way, for reasons I don't need to go into tonight at length, but it meant that even if privately evaluated, the worth of the shares was going down and it wasn't any longer paying dividends. So the whole basis on which the foundation might operate looked to some degree in jeopardy. And then, turning the whole thing in a way upside down, Edsel died first. Edsel suffered greatly, not just, as it were, psychologically at his father's hands, but he became immensely ill, and he ended up getting stomach cancer, and he died first in 1943, which wasn't, of course, the sequencing that had been anticipated when all this had been set up. So, by 1943, things are not in good shape. The motor company isn't doing well. Edsel's died. Although his shares will go to the foundation, they may not be anything like as valuable as they had been earlier on when the company was doing well. And Henry Ford is still there, old, paranoid, difficult, but still exercising far more influence than he ought to, and than he was successfully or effectively able to do. Well, the standard question that historians ask, what happens next? Well, what I think happens next, but it's very difficult to prove, is that the Ford women become for a brief time very important. And women in philanthropy is a burgeoning field, and so it ought to be. The two Ford women in question are Clara, Henry Ford's wife, and Eleanor, Edsel's widow. And it's clear that they exercised a very considerable influence. Both of them actually were themselves significant philanthropists in the world of Detroit. Clara forced her husband Henry, in the end, to recognise the Union of Auto Workers. She told him if he didn't give way, she would sell her own shares. And Henry actually did give way at that point. And Clara and Eleanor together force Henry, Clara's husband, Eleanor's father-in-law, out of wielding any influence in the affairs of the motor company or in the affairs of the foundation. And they push Edsel and Eleanor's eldest son, Henry II, to be both president of the motor company and president of the foundation. And it's clear that that set of decisions, which are not, alas, as well documented as they ought to be, are absolutely crucial in the rebirth of the motor company and the successful development of the foundation. Because it turns out that, backed by Clara and Eleanor, Henry II is the central figure in those developments. In the late 40s and early 50s, he restored and revived the motor company as a going concern, as a result of which the shares enormously increased in value. And he was also the key figure in carrying through the transformation of the Ford Foundation from being this local, small-town, Detroit-based philanthropy to being the richest foundation in America that was going to fix the whole world. Because it was clear by the late 40s, as the Ford Motor Company revived, and as negotiations took place over Edsel's estate and Henry's estate with the federal government and the Internal Revenue, that the Ford Foundation would become very rich because Henry and Edsel's non-voting shares were by this time deemed to be of considerable value. Henry too also recognised that large-scale philanthropy, which is what the Ford Foundation would shortly be able to indulge in and undertake, was a serious issue and a challenging problem. Not until you work at it do you find out how hard it is to give money away and to give it away wisely. That's Henry at this time. And one of the ways in which he sought to increase the prospects that the Ford Foundation would give money away wisely was to recruit to the trustee body a group of people who were not based in Detroit and were not members of the Ford interests. And the pivotal figure here, appointed in October 1946, was Carl T. Compton, the president of MIT, a nuclear physicist, a man who knew his way around the academies of the world, and a man who was very well connected in Washington. And it's Compton who drives forward the foundation's decision to commission various reports to set out some guidelines as to what it's going to do when it becomes staggeringly rich, because it will have so much money you can't just give it away on a random basis to the Detroit General Hospital anymore. And in the late 1940s, two reports were undertaken. The first one by a man called Wyman Fisk, who was a professor at MIT and a colleague of Compton's. The second, a man called Rowan Geither, who was a West Coast lawyer, chairman of the Rand Corporation, and had previously worked at MIT and also knew Compton. And both of these, Geither more than Fisk, produced elaborate reports on how the impending, soon-to-be, upscaled, enormously financially enhanced Ford Foundation will work and what it should do. And they engaged in a whole range of research activity to try to find out what other people thought the foundation ought to do. And one of the crucial figures in offering advice was the then president of Columbia University. And the then president of Columbia University, this is in the late 1940s, as I'm sure you all know, was Dwight David Eisenhower, as it were, filling in time between having been Supreme Allied Commander in Europe and becoming President of the United States. And Eisenhower, not a wholly happy figure as President of Columbia University, it's fair to say, but Eisenhower wrote a very careful, considered, lengthy letter saying what a big, hugely funded private foundation can do is to help us wage war against communism. There is a campaign to be fought for the hearts and minds of people in Europe and beyond against the impending threat, and notice we're in the late 1940s here, of communism. And I think the Eisenhower letter was hugely influential. And it's worth noting that, as it were, in corroboration of the case that Eisenhower made, Geither in particular wrote his report exactly during the period of the Berlin airlift, the greatest confrontation thus far in the Cold War. between the West and the East. And in the end, Guyther suggested that the foundation, hugely augmented as it was now on the brink of being and becoming, should devote itself to the following: the establishment of peace, the bolstering of democracy, the strengthening of the economy, the promotion of education in democratic societies, and the improvement of scientific knowledge of human behaviour and individual relations. He also suggested that the foundation must move its base of operations from Detroit to New York. Well, the Guyther report to this day is regarded as the kind of founding document of the Ford Foundation. It's a piece of, as it were, epistolatory ancestor worship, if I can put it in those terms. But actually, it was pretty vague, apart from these general observations that have been made. And it was particularly vague about the world beyond the United States, not least because almost none of the people who it consulted had ever gone very far beyond the United States, with, of course, the exception of Eisenhower himself. Well, it turned out, nevertheless, that this was the founding document. It set out, albeit in rather general terms, a way that the foundation could behave to promote the well-being of mankind. And it came just in time, because Henry and Edsel's estates were finally settled at the end of 1950, just after the Guyther report. And all the non-voting shares went to the foundation. And as a result of that, it went from being this small-scale Detroit philanthropy with about $30 million to being the richest philanthropy in the world with an endowment just short of $500 million, which was a huge amount of money in the early 1950s. Put in comparative terms, that meant that the Ford Foundation was richer than Rockefeller and Carnegie combined, and its endowment was larger than that of Harvard and Yale combined. It was prodigiously, staggeringly, extraordinarily rich. And it's on that basis that the Ford Foundation set out to try to fix the world, and it's been trying to do so ever since. The fact that it hasn't yet succeeded is perhaps an interesting question that I shall have to address when I get to the end of this book. Well, thereafter, just to finish, as it were, this first part of the book, there were a variety of false starts for particular reasons that, again, I won't go into. The attempt to get the foundation immediately to New York doesn't work, and for several years it's divided between Pasadena in California, Detroit and New York, and that's a kind of nightmare. There are also a set of particular funds set up which are meant to be almost autonomous for a variety of particular purposes, and that didn't work well either, and it took a goodly while to sort that. And also, of course, there's disengagement from Detroit, which finally happens. Terminal grants were given to the institutions which in earlier times the foundation had funded. Eventually, the foundation did indeed settle in New York, and it began a whole range of rather imaginative domestic programs, and it began, uniquely among any of the great foundations of that time, a series of very elaborate overseas programs. And they were so elaborate that it even established particular overseas offices. And this was because, in corroboration, as it were, of the Eisenhower letter that I'd mentioned, Ford did see itself as being in the front line, as assisting, as it were, in a private capacity, the public efforts being made by the United States to win over the allegiance of the non-aligned world of former colonies that were now becoming independent. And it was not at all coincidence that the first two overseas offices that the Ford Foundation established were in India and in Indonesia, the two largest independent countries which had been freed in the late 1940s from the thraldom of colonial dominion. And the two countries where, in the 1950s and 1960s, more than any others, the battle for the loyalty of the non-aligned world was fought out. And for Ford, they were absolutely crucial places to get involved in from the very beginning of this newly realized global agenda and capacity. Well, that's what I've been writing while I've been here. And of course, there's lots more to say than I've been able to summarize here. I'm slightly anxious that this will actually turn out to be the easiest part of the book to write. Because, as I've tried to suggest, it has a very straightforward linear narrative with very considerable momentum, and it's a riveting human drama and family saga. And it's also, of course, relatively small scale in terms of the activities of the foundation, because it hasn't really got going. And I do have this worry that the later sections will actually be much harder, because the whole scale of activities, of course, is so extraordinarily increased and enhanced and augmented. Domestic programs, global programs, exceptionally complicated politics in terms of the foundation and government regulation and investigation in Washington, a whole set of controversies, the vexed relations between presidents and trustees, and, to repeat, the huge upscaling of activity, so that there will be many narratives, as it were, existing in parallel, and I have no idea yet how I'm going to devise an appropriate expositional structure for doing that. Not least because, of course, the last thing you can do is to say, well, here's what's going on in Washington, and meanwhile, in India, this is what's going on. I mean, that just won't work. And I'm not yet clear, I'm afraid, what will. Anyway, this is how I think the rest of the book will look, notwithstanding the point that I've just made. The next section will be called The Cold War Years, 1953 to 65. And that's when Ford really gets going as this global philanthropic behemoth. And it finds itself and positions itself absolutely at the heart of the American establishment. Many of the people who worked for Ford during that period had previously worked on the Marshall Plan. One of the crucial figures is John J. McCloy, a member of that group in those days called the Wise Men, who chaired the Ford Foundation board, who chaired the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and was closely involved in the CIA. And during this period, delivering on the Cold War agenda, initially adumbrated by Eisenhower, Ford and the CIA worked very, very closely together, and several of the CIA's agents were actually employed in the Ford Foundation. And off the back of opening the offices in South Asia and in Indonesia, offices were opened in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Latin America. So Ford intrudes itself onto, as it were, the affairs of the Third World in an astonishingly spectacular way in the 1950s, and was also at the same time sponsoring immensely innovative domestic programs, in particular with regard to the arts in the US and with regard to public television. So that will keep me busy for another year. After that, I'm not yet sure how it'll work, but for now, I've done it under precedence, though I'm not sure that'll be right. The next section will be the presidency of McGeorge Bundy from 1966 to 1979. Bundy was, of course, the darling of the East Coast establishment, educated at Groton and Yale, a member of the Skull and Bones Club, married to a wife who was a quintessential Boston Brahmin, the youngest ever dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, JFK and LBJ's national security advisor, who finally bailed out of the White House and took over the Ford Foundation in 1966 to 67. But Bundy turned out, depending on your point of view, to be extraordinarily radical and innovative, or alternatively, as many people saw him, as a traitor to his class. Because it was Bundy who launched the foundation domestically into a much more radical agenda, putting blacks, women, and poverty right at the centre of what it was doing in the United States, and insisting on a much more diverse board of trustees. They shouldn't all be men, they shouldn't all be over 50, and he made considerable changes there as well. The problem was that Bundy spent far more money than the foundation actually had, and for the first and only time, it did go through a serious financial crisis in the mid-1970s, partly as a consequence of having put up that extraordinary building in New York City, which is architecturally iconic, but cost a vast amount of money. And it was off the back of that that Henry II, the hero of this story in earlier phases, flounces out. He said he's had enough. He's not prepared to continue involvement in a foundation which is now pursuing an agenda to which he was wholly ill-disposed. The next phase is the presidency of Franklin Thomas from 1979 to 1995, a man seen as furthering Bundy's agenda. A very different figure, the first African-American in a position of such power anywhere in America. He intensified Bundy's radical agenda. He supported, for instance, anti-apartheid movements and agitation in South Africa. He ended the link with the CIA very publicly. And it's clear that Thomas's time takes the foundation through the loss of American confidence after Vietnam and Watergate, and then I suppose to a revival of American confidence in the aftermath of the Cold War. So how all that will play out, I don't yet know either. And then I'm ending with the presidency of Susan Beresford from 1996 to 2006. She continued and intensified the radical agenda espoused by Bundy and promoted by Thomas, insisting that social justice was the Ford Foundation's prime aim. And off the back of that, she sought to repurpose the foundation from no longer being an agent of paternal neo-imperialism, which even under Bundy and Thomas it still was, to promoting local empowerment in the Third World. And she therefore set up a whole set of programs to identify potential Third World leaders so that it could support schemes emanating from them rather than emanating from the foundation. It also supported the origin of micro-banks as a further attempt at, as it were, indigenous empowerment for the peoples of the Third World. And so she sought to reposition the Ford Foundation more as an enabler of collaborative global programs than being paternalistically intrusive. And perhaps, who knows, this is the pattern of American philanthropy beyond the American century. Well, as it were, that's the story so far about the story so far that I have been able to piece together. The account I've given of where this book will go is ever more tendentious the further away from the period I've written about it gets. But those do seem to me to be the themes. How it'll work, I don't yet know, but I suppose and hope I shall find out. So I end by quoting McGeorge Bundy. This is an interview he gave in almost the last year of his life, reflecting on his time at Ford. By its nature, he observed, it is difficult, very difficult, to write a foundation history. It is too idiosyncratic. The pudding has so many themes. Well, I'm not wholly discouraged by that, but I suppose I shall find out about 5 years from now. Thank you very much.